All right, welcome back everyone. In the previous episode, hopefully you caught that, finally got some paint on the trailer, and I cleaned up the shop a little bit, and I did move it back inside because it's about a little over 80 degrees outside and it's only 67 here in the shop, so it's much more pleasant to work in. So I'm going to give you a quick kind of a walk around. I didn't do too much after I painted it. I mounted a few of the items that you already knew about, and then we'll start talking about electrical. If you did watch the last episode, I referenced that I might put it on the vehicle hoist to do the electricals, but it's just a little bit wide. The trailer's a little bit wider than what the swing arms on the post are, or on the two posts are. So I'm not going to do that after all. So without the deck boards on it, I should still be able to do most of it without having to get around and crawl around on the floor. So anyway, let's do a quick walk around, and then we'll get going on the electrical. All right, so some things I did after I painted it while it was still outside. I got the tail lights mounted in there, the 3 red ICC lights. Of course, the ramps are on, and if you recall, I think it was with the episode that I did the ramps on, I was irritated with myself that I hadn't mitered the corners, these corners right here on the ramps, and it left that opening in the tubing, which didn't look very nice, so I just purchased some of those. You can buy plastic insert plugs. Maybe that looks like a hole, but that's actually a cap. You can buy plastic insert plugs for pretty much all sizes of square tubing. So I put those in there to finish those off. Stabilization jacks are on. I did, once I put the ramps on, I noticed a couple spots because I had the ramps hanging and it was hard to get every nook and cranny, a couple spots that there could be a little bit more paint. So I'll pick up this brand of paint that I use. They also sell it in spray cans. So I'll just pick up a can of that and touch up a few of those spots. The marker light there on the step is there. Let's see, we'll go to the other side. The front of the fender marker light is there. I also added, in some cases, I don't think trailers this small it's required, but on larger trailers, the red and silver reflective tape is required, but I had some, so I just put it on anyway. So on the rub rail, there's the alternating red and silver reflective tape. The front clearance markers on there. You already knew about the battery in the toolbox. I've got the breakaway battery. It just mounted in there. It mounted to the toolbox. Got the chains on, and I have the battery breakaway switch mounted right there. So that takes care of pretty much all of the kind of accessory stuff, I guess. So that leaves exclusively the wood decking and the electrical. So I did on my punch list, I finished up the punch list by torquing the wheels. That was all that was left. Spare tire mount, I still not sure what I'm going to do there. So I think on the electrical, I'm going to kind of lay everything out, but I think the way I'm going to do it, instead of having to try to hold everything underneath where it'll mount, I'm going to lay it out on top in essence a mirror, an upside down position. That way I can lay the J boxes right on the cross members where they'll go. I can lay out all the cable and the wiring, kind of get it cut to length, and then it'll just be a matter of scooting that underneath and bolting it into place. So it'll be a little bit easier to cut all those lengths and things. So anyway, I'll set you up for kind of a time lapse on that, and then if there's particulars, I'll bring you back and we'll talk about some of the particulars of trailer wiring separate from that. I'll use this this J box that came with the trailer kind of as a prop for someone that maybe has never wired a trailer before and wants to learn a little bit about. There is kind of a standardized color coding, so you can see on the inside of this J box that was this came with the kit. Already had the RV pigtail attached to the J box, so color wise in there. There's going to be seven colors. White. Whether or not you have brakes will kind of indicate, as some of you may know, there's trailers with a four pin connector that's flat. Those will have basically just 3 circuits: left turn, right turn, and tail marker, and ground. In the case of a 7-way, it adds 2 additional circuits, actually 3 additional circuits. So white is always ground, yellow is always left turn, green is always right turn, and brown is always tail marker and clearance lights. So then the additional 3 colors you get when you go to a 7-way is blue, red, and black. Blue, officially blue is supposed to be brakes, but sometimes people will do whatever with it. Typically red is a stop type. If you have, let's say, European cars will have a separate turn signal than they do a stop. So red would be that, and then black is usually a power wire for if you had a battery, things along those lines. I guess we'll add the caveat, some of you may want to debate what the red and the black should be used for, and I would agree those aren't I guess a steadfast rule like left turn, right turn, and tail marker are, because depending on what you're pulling it with and depending on what your trailer is, those can vary. So at any rate, for this trailer, it's going to be the traditional white ground, brown tail marker, yellow left turn, green right turn, blue brakes, and then because the black is a much heavier gauge wire in this to handle the extra amperage of charging the battery. For my case here, it'll be the black will be the 12-volt charging, and the red, frankly, it'll be a spare because I won't use it. So I'll keep laying things out here and then bring it back in a second. So if you recall, in one of the early episodes, I tacked on some 1/4 inch. If I recall, I told you what they were for, so I kind of want to show you how those play out and really what they're for. So I've got the 7-way cable that hooks up to the truck in there, and on those studs on the underside, here's where those come into play. Because there's one there that was already welded on, so I don't have to mess up the paint welding them on afterwards. There's a second one there that holds the cable in place on the bottom, and as it curves around on the tongue, curves around from underneath, it comes up and it's attached here. So it just gives you a nice convenient way, instead of using, not that there's anything wrong with zip ties, but a little bit more secure than the standard zip tie. So anyway, I put those all along the whole trailer. You can kind of see each one of them there on the bottom. They've still got tape on them. So that'll hold the main cable coming down to each one of the junction boxes. So we'll get back to doing that. One thing I want to show you and talk about is wiring terminations. If you're going to build a trailer, especially if you do like I did and you buy a kit, it's going to come, or even if you don't build a trailer, if you just, let's say you want to rewire your trailer, and there's lots of companies that sell lighting kits online. Most of them will come with what's called a Scotch lock. They look like this. I'll show you how they work here in a second. Save yourself some headache and throw these in the garbage. The only reason why I even have one of these in my shop is the fact that it came in the kit. So it's a good example to show you. Because if you use them, I promise you, you will at some point have a wiring a lighting failure and you'll pull your hair out. And then as far as the cause, and there's a good chance this is the case. So if you've never seen a Scotch lock or don't know what a Scotch lock does, it's a really cheesy way to tap into an existing wiring circuit. So let's assume this white wire is a existing circuit, and so if this wire was running, say from the front, let's say it was, it's a white, so it's a ground, but let's say it wasn't a ground, let's say it was a brown, a tail marker, and you wanted to tie in a clearance marker light to it. One of the two cavities in this connector goes all the way through, and the other cavity, I can't really open it up to see, but the other cavity, the other hole goes in, it's open, but then it's blocked on this back side, so the wire can't go through. So the way they work is they actually are hinged, they open up here in the front, so you can snap them over a wire with it. You don't even have to get to the end of it, and then this wire just inserts in the end, and then you take a pair of pliers, I'm not going to do it because I don't want to ruin these wires, and you squeeze down on this little metal blade there. And what that little metal blade does is it goes down and it cuts through the insulation. I'll see if I can pull it out so you can see a close-up of it. So there's the blade. So it cuts through the there. I'll get it against my shirt so you can see better. It cuts through the outside insulation and kind of skies into the copper conductors to make a connection between these two wires, between the source wire and this additional wire that you're going to piggyback on it. And then it's got a little trap door that you snap shut. So they do work, they do function, they make a connection between an existing wire and another wire, but there's no seals whatsoever inside these. You're not getting a really nice tight connection on the wire. And because there's no seals, I promise you they will lead to, especially if you live in a northern state where they use salt on the roads, you will have corrosion and this will be a failure. The connection will fail at some point. So again, save yourself the headache, throw them in the garbage. And there's 4 or 5 different ways that you can do a termination that you don't have to worry about the corrosion and a failure. Some of it depends on, I'll show you one here on the license plates lights. If you're going to just do a butt connection where you're connecting one or more wires together and you're not needing to splice into an existing circuit, a heat shrink butt connector is the way to go. There's some companies that sell some with solder in them. It's a really low temperature solder, so when you heat shrink the plastic, it melts the solder. It's kind of a neat gimmick, but it's not required by any means. A good quality heat shrink butt connector that's crimped with the correct tools will work just fine. If you do want to splice into an existing run, you could either do like I'm doing and have some junction boxes at strategic locations where the wire goes in. You put a ring terminal on the end of the source wire that you want to branch off of, and then you can branch off of that as many times as you want by stacking additional ring eyes on those studs. There's items called splice packs, which are used pretty regularly in all sorts of automotive and off-road equipment, and it's a Weather Pack is a brand. It's a Weather Pack style connector in which the source wire goes into one terminal on the inside of that. There's a silicone seal around it, so it's watertight. And then there can be an additional 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think there's some of them that go up to at least 6, if not more, additional cavities. And you put your other wires. So for instance, as an example, let's say you wanted to have 5 clearance lights and you only had 1 brown wire. You would insert the 1 brown wire as the source, and then you could have 4 more branch wires going out. They all go into that connector. And then on the top side of the connector, there's just a bus bar. There's a little lid that snaps in to seal it off. And inside that lid, there's a bus bar that buses all of those together. So you can have 1 source wire with as many outputs as you need. Again, there's silicone seals on all the connections. So that's another good way to do the same function as a Scotch lock, other than it's more versatile because you can have multiple outlets and it is 100% sealed. So at any rate, if you're going to wire your own trailer and you're going to keep it for a long time, it definitely pays to take the time to do it the correct way with good connection and good terminals. Same thing, any place I can, It's a little bit more wire to run a dedicated ground wire instead of relying on the ground. A lot of lights, and these clearance lights there on the fender, that's the way they are. There's a little metal tab in there, and when you run the mounting screw in, it touches that tab and that creates the ground. I prefer wherever possible to have a light with its own dedicated ground wire, but so that's another area where you can have, if you have lights that aren't working, sometimes just wiggling that screw, one of the mounting screws will reconnect that ground. So anyway, on this trailer, any place I can, I'm gonna run dedicated ground wires. So I'm working on the license plate lights right now. Set you up here, because they're LED, the wires are really, really small. So the smallest I have for my butt connectors is, heat shrink butt connectors, is for 18 through 22 gauge, which is the pink ones. So I've put two of them together because these heat shrinks have the glue in them, so the glue will ooze out. And in best case scenario on a butt connector, it's nice if you can use just one wire. But in the case if you do have to put two wires in it, make sure you're using the butt splices that have the glue in them, because when that glue oozes out, it'll seal between the two wires, so that kind of that gap doesn't give water a path to get in there. And then I'm just going to extend that circuit out to where the junction box is going to go. So if you're using a non-insulated, let me grab my other set of crimping pliers. If you want a really super clean install and the best crimp you can get, though there's nothing wrong with insulated connectors, I prefer in some cases to use non-insulated butt splice barrels, crimp those, and then put a piece of dedicated heat shrink over them, because I believe you can get a better crimp if you use the style of crimpers that actually, they look like this. They have a little nubbin right there. So when you crimp the butt connector, it actually, actually I'll use the dry erase board I can draw it for you. So if you're going to use this would be looking at the butt connector from the end. Normally they start out round, but every butt connector that's manufactured actually has a little tiny joint there where they're not touched. So if you use that style of crimper that I showed you, when you crimp them, you end up with a crimp like this, where it rolls that in. So your wire would be, this is an end view, your wire, cross section of the wire would be in here. And then you can move it to the secondary jaw and squeeze them again, and it makes a very tight crimp. That works fine on non-insulated terminals. You shouldn't use these on insulated terminals, because that little nubbin on the crimper that comes in here like that, it will puncture through the insulation, so you've kind of defeated the purpose. So on insulated terminals, heat shrink or not, you use a crimper that's somewhat like this, and basically it just takes that round butt connector with that joint, and when you're done with it, you end up with kind of a smashed affair. Still works just fine, but you don't get that roll effect. So the point there is, if you're going to use insulated butt connectors, or ring ends, and it doesn't really matter what kind of connector they are, if they're the insulated style like these, with heat shrink on them, use the correct crimper. Otherwise, again, you'll be giving yourself a section right area where you're going to get some corrosion and have a failed connection. These crimpers are pretty straightforward. They're actually color coded for the style of insulated connector you're using, and then they have their ratchet style. So instead of having to guess how hard you squeeze them, you can hear them ratchet down. They won't release until you go far enough to get to that last spot. It clicks again and lets it go, and then that's adjustable. So if you want a tighter crimp or a lesser crimp, you can do that. So I'm just gonna, I'll do one here and show you. Hopefully you can see that a little better now without my hands being in the way. Always give them a good tug afterwards. And because these wires are so small, after I finish this connection, I'll slide another piece of either split loom or something down here. I might just tape them up, but I'll probably use either a piece of hose or a piece of split loom, because they're such fine, dainty wires to give them a little bit of protection. So that's one half of the connection. I'd like to keep the colors, the correct colors wherever I can, but some manufacturers will make stuff, in the case of these LED lights, that's red and black, and then you could think of it more like a battery, red being positive and black being ground. But traditionally in a DC system, automotive equipment, trailer, things like that, white is always the ground. Unlike in a house, white would be neutral and black would be hot. So I try to stick with traditional DC methods. And I didn't have any 2-wire cable that had brown and white, so I have black and white, as you can see here. So I'll still stick with white being it. Somebody might say, well, why wouldn't you do black to black and white to red? Well, then that's really kind of opposite of what, if you're in the junction box, I'm not going to know that there's red and black here. If you're going to be in the junction box, all you're going to see is black and white's always ground. So in the case of this one, it's an LED, so it would work either way. They're not polarity sensitive, or these might be, but at any rate, I'm going to put the ground to the white, like you should do, and the hot to the red, which in this case is black. Perfect world, it would be brown. I'll come back later and heat shrink these, because my little mini torch, it's in the house. So, but then you just heat shrink those. Again, like I said, I'll put an additional protection on there, and then that'll get routed up to the junction box, which goes right about here. You can actually see the mounting plate through the expanded metal. So I'm just going to continue doing that, kind of roughing out all of the sections of wire, making terminations where need be with that method, and then all of that will get routed to the junction box. And the same goes for the junction box. I'll just use a ring eye. That same thing, that's a heat shrink. On the electric brakes, the axle kit kind of came with the electric brake portion, for the most part, pre-wired. So I'll see if I can give you kind of a better close-up here. So what would be the passenger side of the trailer, those wiring terminations were already made, and then they go through a grommet, and the wires are ran through the axle tube. They come out of the axle tube. You can see here where they come out of the axle tube. Then they come up, and they have like I just talked about, 2 wires going into each butt connector. One from the left side, one from the right side, the ground and the hot. These are non-heat shrink. These are insulated but non-heat shrink. So I will cut those off and replace them with heat shrink style. I could run, basically splice all 4 of them into one cable and just use one cable to run over to the J box. But electric brakes pull a fair amount of amperage. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to run, I put mounting studs for the wire clips down each cross member that was closest to the axle. So I'll run a dedicated cable out to each axle connection.
Okay. You don't happen to know where?
So I'll just use one of the taillight mounting studs. And put one small clamp on there. That way, in essence, if the cord ever got yanked on too hard, there'd be a little bit of support there. Probably won't, but certainly doesn't hurt. So that, as you can see, makes a quite a bit cleaner install. Then that cable will just get routed to over to the junction box with a couple more cable clamps to hold it in place. So as I make a few other a lot of these other terminations, the butt connectors, all that's going to be duplicate, so you don't need to see those. But as I make other terminations that might be a little bit different than that, I'll bring you back and show you those. Okay, I mentioned earlier an alternative to using the butt connectors with the heat shrink built in is to use an uninsulated butt connector and then add heat shrink after the fact. So I thought I'd show you a quick example of that, because it does allow you to crimp them, I think, in a little bit better crimp. So I've got a situation here where it's just going to be 2 bare wires, or 2 wires with non-insulated connectors sealed with standalone heat shrink, and then the jacket bridged with another heat shrink. So you can see hopefully there with the dimple on the end of that, where the crimpers, this style of crimpers that has the notch, the dimple right there, makes those, and then you follow up. So that's the crimp here. So I'll ultimately slide 2 pieces of heat shrink on here, leaves just enough room to get the other crimp done, and then I'll slide this piece of heat shrink up over the whole thing. So I'll show you that here in just a sec. Okay, so there's with the 2 butt connectors connected and a little bit of small heat shrink, and then you follow up with the other piece of heat shrink over the jacket itself. My little mini torch was out of butane, so I had to just grab the barbecue lighter. Doesn't work quite as fast, but still gets the job done. Some people prefer a heat gun. And that way you can get it's a little bit lower profile connection if need be. Okay, so I'm about finished up with the junction box that's in the middle of the trailer that the axle brakes, electric brakes run to, and a couple clearance lights run to, and then it's a midpoint to extend the main cable down the middle. So before I finalize that and get that J-box mounted underneath where it would be hard to film, I thought I'd give you a quick look of how those look when they're, for the most part, completed. I just have one more clearance light to bring into it. So let me pan you around and get you a view. So basically all the terminations come into the junction blocks, the colors coordinated. As you can see, we've got the brown terminal has got all of the clearance markers on it. The right turn is extended, the left turn is extended, we've got the ground, and then down here is the brake termination on the blue stud. So these junction boxes come with a complete set of grommets that go in the side They come with some of the grommets like these that already have a hole in them. And they also come with several solid grommets that you can make a smaller hole in, or if you're using the 2-wire that's kind of a flat cable, you can slice that shape out, or if you have a blank cavity that you're not going to use in the junction box, you just stick it in as it is, and then that kind of seals that up. One thing I will do before I put the final lid on is just to hedge my bed a little bit. There might be some condensation that builds up in the J boxes over time, so I'll take and brush on some dielectric grease over all of the studs and the ring eye terminals and the nuts so that they're get a little bit of extra protection. So that's kind of the how a J box gets terminated out. I probably won't bring you back for any more wiring stuff because it's pretty much, you've seen all the different types of terminations that I'm going to do. It's just a matter of tidying up a few things. I may bring you back for in the next episode when I start on the boards. I'll touch on any wiring that I did do that wasn't, you hadn't already seen, maybe on the breakaway switch, things like that. So okay, so I came out to the shop tonight. I got a little bit of time after dinner, but I'm going to take a little bit of a break from the electrical. And I noticed I found myself kind of setting things on the fenders, and there's no doubt that over the years stuff will get set on top of the fenders. They might even get stepped on, and of course the paint would end up taking the brunt of that. So I've got some 4-inch wide 80 grit traction tape that's black that I'm going to put a section here on top of the fender, kind of to protect it, and I think it'll give it a little bit of a contrast. So basically what I did is I cut out two, they're 4-inch wide, as I said, I cut out two 18-inch or 36-inch long strips, 18 inches the half point, and then I put them facing each other, and I'm just using a roll of Scotch tape or masking tape here to mark a radius on 2 of the corners. So instead of it having squared corners, it'll have a nice radius corner. I'll show you the finished product here in a second. So I'm cutting both of those at the same time. That way it kind of guarantees that they will line up, because it'll be an 8-inch wide strip, 2 strips. So I'm going to get that marked out and cut those out, and then I'll use a little bit of masking tape as a layout line to make sure that I get them centered right where I want them. And then we'll see what it looks like. A tip is, don't use your good scissors when cutting this out. I have a tendency to grab these scissors. I really like these scissors. Mac makes them. They're super sharp. They've actually got a cable cutter in them, but given it's basically sandpaper, sticky sandpaper, I don't want to use those and ruin them. So I think this is a pair of the $1.99 ones that Harbor Freight sells, or used to sell at least. I don't know what they sell now. Okay, for the layout, all I did was mark the center spot on this top portion of the fender. Then on one of the pieces of tape, I've got a small piece of blue tape with the center marked on that, so I can line the center up. And then I also picked a spot here where my the edge of the traction tape needs to go, so that you'll end up leaving about a 3/4 inch reveal all the way around. So I'm just going to use some 3/4 inch wide masking tape to put on those marks and kind of use that as a guide. So then you can see how I can use that tape to line up this back edge, and then I line up this one blue spot, or a piece of blue tape. There's a little tiny black dot on there. Anytime we do a fair amount of this kind of stuff at work, and if they're decals or things that are a little bit thinner that you can float on. Use a lot of soapy water, or that foaming glass cleaner works really good. But this stuff is pretty thick, so you can't really float it on. So I find the best way to do it is to peel back just the corner portion. So I peeled back just a few inches, hold that up off of there, get it positioned where it belongs. And while the rest of it's held exactly in position, then slowly tack that portion down. And then that kind of holds the alignment, and then you can pull the full backing off. Stretch it kind of tight. And I'm going to try to just stay off of the masking tape line so it doesn't get trapped, or it doesn't trap the masking tape down. And take the masking tape off. Alright, so there, that gives you a view of what it looks like. I think it makes it look kind of nice and gives you some protection when you're setting things up there. So I'll get the other side done, and then I might move on to a little bit of wiring tonight. It is a little bit tough on your hand to try to push it down good and adhere it with your hand, because it's like 80 grit sandpaper. So I just grabbed one of these J rollers that you use for basically adhering anything. Make sure there's any air bubbles pushed out. Things like that. So I think that does get us pretty close to finishing up this episode. I did get the other fender, the other traction tape on the other fender, so both fenders now have it on it. So I will kind of, I think, cut this episode off here and see you back in the next episode, hopefully, for the lumber. And then I've already put together most of the cost comparisons between what it cost me to build this and if I was to go out and buy it. My goal is to, I went online and looked, and you can find a few trailers that are similar with pricing, but for the most part it's difficult to find pricing online short of looking at the used market. So the town I'm close to is a large town with plenty of trailer dealers, so I'm just going to swing by a trailer dealer and tell them exactly what I want. It's configured as closely to this trailer as I can, and have them give me a quote, and we'll see how that quote compares out with what my costs are. So if you want to see the final project, swing back by hopefully next week, next Saturday morning, and I'll be putting lumber on. Thanks for watching.